The Crisis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Chapter 1. Tearing the Fabric. The rain cloud of adversity is spreading over their heads. Calamity is showing itself. Inauspiciousness is hovering behind and in front. From left and from right is coming the cry, "Who were you yesterday and what have you become today? Just now you were awake and now you have gone to sleep." Prologue to the Musaddas of the Indian Muslim poet Hali, first published in 1879 on the Ebb and Flow of Islam, translated by Christopher Shackle and Javed Majid, Oxford University Press, Delhi, 1997. What marks the decline or end of civilization? It is clear that certain civilizations and cultures have irretrievably disappeared from the passage of human history. The Mesoamerican civilization of the Maya are a case in point. They collapsed, leaving monuments to their former glory, but little else besides. Carthage was physically erased from existence by the punitive acts of a pitiless Rome. Carthago delenda est, said Cato the Elder, and he meant it. Most distinct civilizations, however, are either absorbed into more successful ones, frequently through conquest, or continue with their distinct pattern but in a greatly weakened or submissive state. The retreat of Islamic civilization. The apparent decline of the Islamic civilization has been for the historian's mill for over 300 years, yet without any satisfactory or definitive conclusions as to its extent, causes, and prospects. The early versions of the decline of Islam connect it to the fall of Baghdad to the Mongols in the 13th century, a discredited thesis, but one which still colors the popular imagination. What it lacks is historical veracity. It makes up with the sheer drama of the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. It also perpetrates the dangerously deceptive conflation of Islam with the Arabs, ignoring the continuing vitality of the post-Abbasid empires and states based in Iran, Central Asia, North India, and of course the Ottoman world. A universal consensus has evolved, however, to the effect that Islamic civilization has been in decline since 17th century and that the community of the world of Islam, the huge hemispheric Islamicate space, has been under serious assault both from within and without. The patterns of unity that marked this universe appear to have broken up, leaving powerful collective memories of what had been, imagined or otherwise. Will the civilization of Islam ever be capable of regeneration in the form and extent of its past? Is this a dangerous nostalgia which could descend into an irascible sullenness, or worse, into violence and terror? Islamic civilization has occupied a critical and commanding position in the world history. However, the redefinition of the world according to the norms of modernity and the huge technological, cultural, military, and economic power of the West, centered as it is around the United States and increasingly also of East Asia, have consigned it to an essentially subordinate and even meaningless role. Islam, even on its own terms, appears to be at odds with the rest of the modern world. A once distinguished historian of the Islamic civilization has ended up by treating the subject of his lifelong studies as a form of tranquilizing drug, bringing comfort and peace of mind to countless millions, but little else besides, to relieve unrelenting poverty and underachievement. At best, Islam is damned with faint praise, which accentuates its marginalization and irrelevance. This is not the only depiction of Islam. There are by now a large number of apologists who argue for Islam's compatibility with the modern world. They include Muslims and non-Muslims, scholars and laymen. Their musings are driven by a desire to make Islam fit into the shoe of modernity and into the world of universal human and democratic rights. Both these attitudes can trace their lineage to similar debates, which have been raging ever since Islamic civilizations moved from being the dangerous other to falling into the sphere of control of the European powers. There is a remarkable resonance between the spirited clashes of the 19th century among Islam's defenders and detractors and what is taking place now between proponents of the permanent ascendancy of the West as the engine of the world history and those who believe in the potential of Islamic civilization to revitalize itself, regain its confidence, and assert its vision on mankind. Now that Islam is once again the dangerous other, the outcome of these debates momentous consequences. These issues first broke into the public arena in the 19th century as the European powers' hold on the Islamic world consolidated. European encroachments into the Muslim territory had begun well before this period, but the protagonists were not primarily states but commercial companies with special often monopoly charters. Companies such as the English East India Company, founded in 1600, or the Dutch United East Indies Company, VOC, which was established in 1602, were also authorized to wage war and negotiate treaties. As these companies sought to dominate the trade in spices and other commodities and goods from territories ruled by Muslims, they encountered the first signs of popular resistance. In Java, a rebellion against the Dutch VOC company broke out in 1670, led by the charismatic Sufi Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassari. Born into a noble family from the Celebs, he departed for Mecca when he was 18 to pursue his religious education. He was initiated into a number of Sufi orders and returned home to become a teacher and spiritual guide, as well as son-in-law to the Sultan of Banten in Java. The rebellion was finally put down in 1683, whereupon Sheikh Yusuf, at the age of 68, was exiled to the Cape Colony, which was also run by the Dutch East Indies Company. The few years that Sheikh Yusuf spent in Cape Colony before his death in 1699 left a lasting mark on the course of Islam in South Africa. His burial place in Cape became a much visited shrine for the Muslims of South Africa. But the age of European commercial company brandishing a royal monopoly charter and acting as a vanguard of the penetration of Muslim lands did not last beyond the 19th century. It was now the turn of nation states to dominate as imperial powers. The periphery of the Islamic world came under attack first. France launched its North African empire with the capture of Algiers in 1830, sparking a decades-long struggle against strong local resistance led by the towering figure of the Abdul Qadir. In 1858, following the savage repression of a widespread insurrection against British encroachments, Britain finally imposed its direct imperial authority over India, displacing centuries of Muslim control, even though mainly titular, over large parts of the subcontinent. The British government also abolished the East India Company, which had directly administered most of India. Britain added Egypt to its dominion over Islamic lands in 1882. By the end of the 19th century, entire swathes of the Muslim territory fell under European control, leaving only a shrinking Ottoman Empire and the Jar dynasty in Iran as much diminished states. By the end of the First World War, what remained of that rump became reduced even further as the Ottoman Empire, for long the pride of Muslim power, was broken up into an array of successor states in the Arab Middle East and Turkey. Islamic civilization, which had nearly always been coeval with the rule by Muslims over Muslims, had to contend with the drastically changed world order. In earlier times, when Muslims came under the control of non-Muslim powers, the outcome was, more often than not, mass expulsions and an early form of ethnic cleansing. The experience of Muslims in Spain after the fall of Granada in 1492 is a case in point. The retreat of the Ottoman power in the Balkans is another example where displacement and expulsion of long settled Muslim populations was a concomitant of the establishment of nation states in the former Balkan territories of the empire. However, the crisis that affected the Muslims' self image as a result of the imperial invasions and intrusions of the 19th and 20th centuries was of qualitatively different nature. The incoming powers sought economic and political dominion and disposed and displaced large numbers of people in the process. But in only a few instances was there a concerted effort to replace the indigenous population through colonial settlements or an ethnically or religiously motivated plan to denude the area of its Muslim population. That would come later. The projection of European imperial power in an almost effortless demonstration of its superiority in military, technical, material, organizational, and governance matters challenged the core assumptions that underlay the worldview of Islam. Nearly all contemporary Muslim observers of the unfolding drama of European conquest and expansion would bemoan the huge chasm which had opened between the capabilities of the two civilizations and the helplessness of Islam in front of the European. As a would-be reformer wrote in 1879, "O sons of the East, don't you know that the power of the Westerners and their domination over you came about through their advance in learning and education and your decline in these domains? Are you satisfied after your past achievements to remain in that wretched state into which you were plunged by ignorance and error?" Missing the danger signals. The failure of the Muslim rulers and societies to address the twin threats of growing European imperial power and the advent of modernity has exacerbated the Islamic crisis. At one level, this was prompted by the unwillingness of a long dominant civilization which had been confident of its superior worth to engage with what it considered a lesser form. This is certainly the perspective of those who see Islam as engaged in a millennium-long struggle with other civilization, in particular with Christendom, when for most of the time Islamic civilization was ascendant. The sense that Islamic civilization could learn anything of consequence from such cultures, until then considered marginal, was preposterous. The religion of Islam had perfected, and Muslims, as long as they remained faithful to Islam's precepts, would ensure their victory in this world and the next. At another level, this failure has more to do with the unprecedented rate at which the technical and scientific advances in the West developed after the 17th century. They created an almost unbridgeable technological gap between the West and the Muslim empires of the pre-modern period. The adoption of the techniques of modern warfare and administrative organization by the Muslim empire of the era, mainly for defensive reasons, simply could not keep pace with the changes taking place in the West. It was almost inevitable that the confrontation, when it occurred, would be one-sided. Islamic civilization had perfected itself within its own realm and did not have the attributes necessary to confront a civilization organized along unfamiliar and ultimately more dynamic principles. Of course, these arguments cannot be conclusive. Their starting point has mainly been an Occidental framework leading to conclusions which are not shared by those whose conceptual basis is different. Another perspective is that of the West's overt proselytizers, be they religiously or racially inspired or simply intoxicated by the very success of the Western civilization. The much marginalized Orientalists of the 19th and 20th century fit partly into this category, although it is not too clear how far they were motivated by their supposed role as imperialism's apologists and handmaidens. Muslim thinkers have understandably viewed the causes of their own decline from a different perspective, but they were certainly affected by the torrent of analysis of their civilization emanating from the metropolises of the imperial power. In all of these variants of the question, what went wrong? Few have stood back to assess the failure of the large parts of the Islamic world to recognize the danger signals. The initial threat came from West as well as from territorial expansion of the Tsarist state. It arrived imperceptibly and took Islam completely unawares. Islam did not face much of the menace from Hinduism, Confucianism, or Buddhism. China had been inward looking for centuries. Japan was an insular power and had effectively cut itself off until the arrival of Commodore Perry's flotilla of black ships in 1853 in Tokyo Bay. The warships had been dispatched by President Fillmore as a show of force, with the demand that Japan open itself up to the international trade. In most of India, Hinduism had been subordinate to the primacy of Muslim rule. Muslim travelers and diplomats in the West could not quite translate what they saw and experienced into an urgent clarion call to action. And when the threat finally began to reach home, through military defeats, superior Western technical and organizational skills, and seizure of markets by Western manufactured goods, it was never recognized for what it was until it was almost too late. For example, the gradual extension of the reach of East India Company into large parts of India presaged the destruction of Muslim power in the subcontinent. But the campaigns of Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, were equally directed against the recalcitrant Muslim princes and rulers who had made common cause with the company. In his final battle against the British in 1799, the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, in which he was killed, Tipu Sultan had to face not only the troops of the company but an equally large force raised against him by the Muslim Nizam of Hyderabad. The flood of adventurers and land grabbers into Algeria in the 1830s and 1840s did not galvanize all of Algeria's tribes into a common front in the face of the menace from foreign colonizers and settlers. Neither could these tribes relate the gathering threat to the inclusion of their territories into France's empire. There was little understanding of the dynamics of imperial powers, and the patterns by which their control and dominion were achieved were not fully understood by Muslims. In other instances, the threats were simply ignored because recognizing them would have conflicted with one or more of the established centers of power. So the resistance of the Ottoman elite forces, the Janissaries, to wholesale reform and reorganization was partly due to their fears that their privileges and unique structures would be abolished. Similarly, the religious scholars or ulema class in nearly all the 19th century Muslim empires refused to countenance the introduction of administrative, educational, and legal reforms because that would have undermined their own status as guardians over law and education. Muslim leaders of command and genius did appear on the scene, but they were severely mismatched, especially when the European powers would bring all of its material and organizational resources to bear. Frequently, the leader of the time would be fighting several battles against his fellow Muslim rulers and primitive allies, as they would neither acknowledge nor accept his command, driven as they were by jealousies and fear of loss of power and status. Betrayals and double dealings by one's own people were the order of the day in the wars of the Amir Abdul Qadir against the French in Algeria, 1832 to 1847, or in those of Imam Shamil against the Russians in Chechnya and Dagestan, 1834 to 1859. This experience would be repeated whenever traditional leaders first rose to confront the intruders. In the case of Abdul Qadir in particular, the necessary combination of religious authority and military prowess could have provided the prototype for the sort of leadership which was needed in order to secure for Islam the space for coming to terms with technification and its profound implications before European power became irresistible. Resistance of traditional Islam. The campaigns of Abdul Qadir, frequently termed jihad, also provide tantalizing glimpses into the particular way, Muslim societies could have slipped into the pathways of modernity on their own terms. Abdul Qadir was not unaware of the material and technical advances of his adversaries. He confronted them regularly on the battlefield. In the state he ruled in Algeria, he did try to introduce the elements of the new technical civilization, but always in a role subordinate to the Islamic nature of his government. His was the last generation of those who confronted these challenges from an Islamic framework that was not affected or distorted by a superimposed European imprint. The overlay of modern Western institutions and perspectives necessarily changed the state of mind of the next wave of Muslim leaders. This began roughly around the mid 19th century. By that time, the effect of European ideas, institutions, and power began to dominate the world of Islam. The prevalent worldview of Islam, which Abdul Qadir and his contemporaries held to be true, quickly turned into the traditional view and later into the reactionary view as they were rapidly planted by new frameworks. At its core, this view was based on the twin pillars of Sharia law governing the outer life and the ethical foundations underpinning Tariqa Sufism, foundations which provided for social solidarity. The latter were ubiquitous religious orders that existed throughout the world of Sunni Islam, with a rough counterpart provided by the popular piety associated with the veneration of the Imams in Shia Islam. There were other forms of popular organizations that provided for the social cohesion in the world of pre-modern Islam. In the setting of Islam's cities and towns, these included the craft and professional guilds associated with the Futawa or Malgre movements. In Ottoman Turkey, such guilds were known as Akhis, in Iran as the Awan Mardi. These also had a profound ethical foundation and linked their adherents in a long chain leading back to the early spiritual masters of Islam. The qualities that Abdul Qadir exhibited during his near 20-year struggle with the French, and equally importantly during his imprisonment in France and exile to Turkey and Syria, were a textbook case for the type of inspirational leadership that fitted into the heroic mold of Islamic history. In critical times, a leader would emerge who, by military, organizational, and political genius, would overcome formidable odds, repel aggressors, and re-establish justice and order. Saladin had been just such a leader, at least in the profane world. His valorous achievements against the Crusaders had receded from popular memory and had languished for centuries unrecognized until they were resurrected in the 19th century and re-entered Muslims' imaginations. In religious terms, it was the person of Mahdi, the Redeemer, who played the role of one who saved the Muslims from oppression and godlessness. The great revolt of the Neo Mahdi Muhammad Ahmad in the Sudan in 1881 against Anglo-Egyptian subjugation was such a case of heroic leadership which combined the religious with the political and military element. Abdul Qadir combined several qualities in an epic struggle against the might of the French Empire, a struggle which was ultimately doomed to failure. His extraordinary feats of chivalry became the stuff of legend and carried into his period of exile. His treatment of his enemies was invariably correct and marked by his meticulous observance of the Islamic rules of warfare. At one point, he released his French prisoners of war because his army did not have sufficient provisions for them. They were the very virtues that summed up the prototype of the inspired leader. They were undoubtedly rooted in the deep Islamic identity through which events and personalities were filtered and assessed. Abdul Qadir addressed the French not in the idiom of the race or nation, but in that of religion and the civilization it nurtured. How do you boast of the power of France without knowing the power of Islam? The past centuries are the best witness of power of Islam and its victories over the over its enemies. And we, even though we may be weak as you claim, are strong by the grace of the one and only God. The response of Imam Shamil, a Sufi sheikh of Naqshbandi order, as he was fighting the Russian incursions into the Caucasus in the same period, would have been no different. There is some anecdotal evidence that Shamil may have met Abdul Qadir in Makkah during Hajj, the obligatory Muslim pilgrimage to Makkah of 1825. The two Sufi adepts would later lead two of the most celebrated wars of Muslim resistance to European advances. Abdul Qadir was immersed from his earliest youth into Sufi tariqa of his father, Muhyiddin, who was a sheikh of Qadiri order and a follower of the great Andalusian medieval mystic Ibn al-Arabi. The governments that Abdul Qadir and Shamil established for brief interludes before they were overwhelmed were the Sharia-based. In the Caucasus, the period of Shamil's state is known as the time of Sharia. There was no other model that they would or could have considered. At the same time, Abdul Qadir could sense the weaknesses of his society and was aware that the struggle might be unsustainable, not only because of the military imbalance, but also because France embodied the desperate challenges of technological and organizational proficiency his world had not yet found means to cope with. The truces which he signed with the French and which punctuated the war were partly to do with his realization that the conflict could not, in the long run, work to the advantage of the Muslims. Above all, time was needed, but it was not forthcoming. With his struggle being ended by a combination of extreme French brutality and serial betrayals by his allies, Abdul Qadir opened another chapter in the many ways more remarkable in his life. This phase saw full flowering of his spiritual consciousness. He understood that his outer jihad was lost because of his fatal weakness in his society and because of the absence of any tools in his armory with which to confront the utterly new forces it was facing. In many ways, Abdul Qadir was the last leader of the pre-modern Islamic era who sought to understand and address the challenges of the emergent world in terms of Islam's classical heritage. Until his surrender in 1847 to the Duke d'Aumale, Abdul Qadir had spent his entire life without any serious exposure to the Europeans or European ways, even though he had kept abreast of debates in the French Assembly in so far as they related to France's Algerian policies. After that, the Islamic response to imperial expansion and to modernity became inflected with the creeping modernization of Muslim societies. Even traditionalists Malgre were unable to frame a worldview free from the new paradigms that were sweeping the globe. Spirituality and leadership in Islam. Abdul Qadir's extraordinary spirituality has been virtually ignored in assessment of his significance as a leader. Nearly all biographies gloss over the years of his exile in Turkey and Syria, when he appeared to have made an accommodation with the French occupation of Algeria. Historians have preferred to concentrate on his role as military figure and latterly as nationalist hero. In fact, it was not his careful observance of the outer rules of Islamic conduct that was striking. This was the norm nearly of all the Muslim leaders of the period. Rather, it was his intense spiritual exercises which he conducted in private during his years of campaigning. A chronicler of Abdul Qadir's wars was Leon Roche, a Frenchman who had feigned to convert to Islam in order to join the Amir's entourage. Roche, pretending to be asleep, observed Abdul Qadir at night during the siege of an Algerian town in 1838. He was standing there 3 steps away from me. His 2 arms were raised to the height of his head. He had come to an ecstatic state. His aspirations towards the heaven were such that he seemed no longer to touch the earth. Abdul Qadir's heightened self-awareness was central to his persona. It continued in a more open and obvious manner in his years of exile, especially as he settled into a more pronounced contemplative life in the Ottoman Damascus. He was a noted commentator on Ibn al-Arabi and wrote a magnificent spiritual work, the Mawaqif, on the milestones of spiritual seeker. In another extraordinary feat of chivalry and courage, his mansion compound became a refuge for thousands of Christians of Damascus who were fleeing from the murderous onslaughts of the mobs during the Maronite and Druze wars in Mount Lebanon in 1860. Lenoussi, the acting French consul in Damascus at the time, credited him with saving the lives of 11,000 Syrian Christians. It would be impossible to separate Abdul Qadir's conduct and achievements from his heightened spiritual awareness. This also explains the speed with which he came to terms with French and, by inference, European preponderance, and his subsequent reluctance to lend his name to anti-colonial agitation. His intense connection with the medieval master Ibn al-Arabi went beyond his immersion in the latter's works. He visited his tomb in Damascus during his earliest pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, and in his exile years, Abdul Qadir gave frequent instructions in the system of Ibn al-Arabi. There is sufficient evidence to consider Abdul Qadir to have been a follower of Ibn al-Arabi's school, the so-called Akbarian school of Sufism, even during his campaigns against the French. Before his death, Abdul Qadir ordered that his body should be interred near the tomb of Ibn al-Arabi himself, and it was from there that his remains were returned to Algeria in 1966. The same Ibn al-Arabi would write in one of his masterful spiritual poems, "My heart has become capable of all forms, for gazelles a meadows, for monks a monastery." But at the same time, he would not hesitate to admonish a ruler for not applying the precepts of the Sharia. For Abdul Qadir, there was no contradiction between fighting the French for years at immeasurable odds and being prepared to walk away from this once it became obvious that it was no longer propitious to continue, but rather to acknowledge the changed circumstances. As he wrote to French provisional government following the 1848 revolution, protesting his imprisonment, which violated French oaths given at his surrender. "I defended my country and my religion as long as I could. When I was conquered, when it was impossible for me any longer to doubt that God, for inscrutable reasons, had withdrawn his support from me, I decided to withdraw from the world." The spiritual dimension of Islamic leadership was an essential component of the archetypal leader in the pre-modern times. The systematic distancing of the requirements of spiritual attainment in the making of a leader became a trait of all later Muslim reformers and thinkers. In fact, modernist Islam dismissed all claims for spiritual realization implicit in the Sufi orders. Later, this turned into outright hostility, opening the way for the elimination of the spiritual in determining the suitability of a leader. This dichotomy between the worldly and the spiritual has always been a feature in Islamic history. More often than not, was settled in favor of worldly, cunning, and duplicitous leadership. It goes back to the earliest days of Islam of the 7th century, when the archetypal worldliness of Muawiyah and his Umayyad descendants were pitted against the archetypal spirituality of the household of the Prophet. In practice, the exigencies of the political power in Muslim lands have tended to ignore the imperatives of moral, let alone spiritualized, rule implicit in the worldview of Islam itself. This trait was naturally accelerated in modern times, resulting in the astonishing argument made by modernists that it was the spiritual dimension of Islam, distorted by the Sufi orders, that led to the decay and decrepitude of the Muslim countries and opened them to foreign exploitation and conquest. Spirituality became suspect, and with it, the possibility that leadership could arise from the inspired individual. This tendency was increased by the deterioration of the condition of the Sufi brotherhoods themselves. By early 20th century, colonial authorities had managed in many instances to undermine the traditional resistance to their power of the Sufi brotherhoods. The colonial governments encouraged the Sufi brotherhoods to concern themselves exclusively with spirituality, frequently by co opting sheikhs of the order who were willing to collaborate with or at least tolerate the presence of the colonial power. This neutralized the orders as a potential focus for dissent and resistance and frequently put them on a collusion course with the more radical anti colonial Islamic modernists of the time. For example, the Anti Colonial Association of Muslim Scholars in Algeria was virulently opposed to the Sufi tariqas and saw them as an obstacle to raising the political consciousness of ordinary Algerians.